They threw the bread at her feet, not handed it, not offered it across a counter like she was worth the simple dignity of eye contact. Threw it. Floyd Garner, who ran the only dry goods store in Red Hollow and never let anyone forget it, tossed a half-wrapped loaf of bread across the wooden floor of his shop and watched it skid to a stop near Mara Whitfield's boots. Then he crossed his arms and grinned at the two men leaning against his counter, making sure they were watching. "Save us both the trouble," he said. "You pick it up, and I don't have to pretend I touched your hand when I give it to you." The men laughed. One of them looked away. Embarrassed, maybe, but not enough to say anything. Never enough to say anything. Mara stood there in the doorway of Garner's store with her coin purse in her hand and the morning sun pressing hot against her back, and she did not move. She was 26 years old and had been humiliated in this town so many times that she sometimes thought her skin must be made of something different from everyone else's. Thicker, maybe, or just more accustomed to absorbing the blow without breaking. She looked at the bread on the floor. She looked at Floyd Garner's grinning face. She put her coin purse back in her skirt pocket and walked out. She did not pick up the bread. That was the thing people in Red Hollow never understood about Mara Whitfield. They thought her size made her slow. They thought her silence made her weak. They had been reading her wrong for 3 years, ever since she'd arrived on the eastern stage with 2 bags and no family and nowhere particular to go, and in all that time not one of them had bothered to look close enough to see what was actually there. Red Hollow sat at the edge of nothing, which was the kindest way to describe it. It wasn't a bad town exactly. It had a church and a school and a doctor who came through twice a month and a saloon that stayed quieter than most. But it was the kind of place where people arrived by accident and stayed because leaving took more energy than they had left. The frontier had chewed through 3 generations of settlers in that valley, and what remained was a population that had learned to be suspicious of anything soft, anything gentle, anything that couldn't immediately prove its usefulness. Mara had arrived in Red Hollow in the spring of 1883, answering an advertisement placed by a widower named Theodore Crane, who needed a wife and a mother for his 4 children, and said as much in 20 blunt words in a newspaper printed 2 states away. She had written him a careful letter. He had written back. She had spent 4 months' wages on the stage ticket and arrived at the appointed time to find Theodore Crane standing at the depot with his hat in his hands and his face going pale in a way that told her everything before he opened his mouth. "I wasn't expecting," he started. "I know," she said. "The letter didn't—" "I know," she said again. He married a woman named Helen Pratt 6 weeks later. Helen Pratt was thin and blonde and had come from a good family in Ohio, and she smiled at Theodore Crane like he had hung the moon, and Mara supposed that was probably enough. She didn't blame him for it. She blamed the world that had built the arithmetic, the one that added a woman's worth up in measurements she would never match. But she didn't blame Theodore Crane. He was just a man doing the math he'd been taught. What she hadn't anticipated was having nowhere to go afterward. She had spent everything on the ticket. She had no family willing to take her back east. Her mother was gone 3 years by then. Her father remarried to a woman who considered Mara an embarrassment best kept at a distance. And so she stayed. She found work where she could. She took in mending. She helped old Caleb Purdy at the livery stable when his back went bad in the winters, hauling feed and mucking stalls without complaint because the work was honest and it paid. She kept to herself because keeping to herself was safer than the alternative. But Red Hollow had a long memory and a short tolerance, and Mara Whitfield, the mail-order bride nobody wanted, had become a kind of fixture in the town's collection of private jokes. Women crossed the street when she walked past, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the low-grade discomfort that came from having to look at something that reminded them of what failure looked like. Children said things that their mothers heard and didn't correct. And men like Floyd Garner tossed bread across their floors and called it a transaction. She had learned to take the long way home. Mom. The morning after the incident at Garner's store, Mara was at the livery at first light, which was where she went when she needed to think without being watched. Caleb Purdy was already there, sitting on an upturned crate with a coffee tin balanced on his knee, his face weathered to the texture of old saddle leather, and he looked up when she came in and didn't say anything about her eyes being red. Caleb Purdy was one of the few people in Red Hollow who talked to Mara like she was a person rather than a problem to be managed. He was 63 years old and had buried a wife and 2 sons, and had no patience left for the opinions of people who hadn't earned the right to hold them. "You eat?" he asked. "I'll eat later." "That means no." He reached behind the crate and produced half a corn biscuit wrapped in cloth and held it out without ceremony. "Sit down. The bay mare's got a stone bruise on her left foreleg and she won't let me near it." Mara took the biscuit. She sat down on a hay bale and ate it slowly while Caleb told her about the mare. And she let the familiar smells of the stable, hay, horse, manure, sawdust, the faint iron smell of old harness leather, settle around her like something solid. This was the only place in Red Hollow where she felt her actual size rather than some exaggerated version of it. The horses didn't have opinions about her. The work was just work. "Garner again?" Caleb asked, not looking at her. "It doesn't matter." "Didn't say it mattered. Asked if it was Garner." She looked at the biscuit in her hand. "He threw the bread on the floor." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Man's got a cruelty in him that's got nothing to do with you." He set down his coffee. "Never did. You know that. Knowing it and feeling it aren't the same thing." "No," he said. "They're not." She finished the biscuit. She went to look at the mare's leg, talking to the animal in a low, steady voice while she ran her hands along the fetlock. And after a few minutes, the mare stopped shifting her weight and stood still and let Mara work. It was always like that. She had a patience with animals that she couldn't quite replicate with people. Or maybe it was that animals didn't require her to defend herself while she was trying to help them. She was still crouched by the mare's leg, pressing carefully along the bruised tissue when she heard the stable door open behind her and new boots on the plank floor. She didn't look up. Caleb's customers came and went at odd hours. "She's favoring it," said a voice she didn't recognize. "How bad?" "Stone bruise," Mara said, still not looking. "She'll need 2 weeks off the rough ground. Pack the hoof twice a day. Mud or wet clay works fine if you don't have a poultice. Keep her on soft footing." A pause. "You the veterinarian?" She looked up then. The man standing in the stable entrance was tall and broad through the shoulders, in the way of someone who had spent years doing physical work, rather than the way of someone who had simply grown large. He was maybe 40, with a face that had been out in the sun long enough to leave permanent lines around his eyes, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not the usual sequence of assessment and dismissal, just a kind of straightforward attention, like he was listening. "No," she said. "I work here." He looked at the mare. He looked at the way the horse had gone calm under Mara's hands. "You know horses." "Some." He crouched down beside her, which was unexpected. Most men stayed standing, and looked at the foreleg. He had the careful eyes of someone who had spent time reading animals. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mara Whitfield." He didn't react to the name the way people in Red Hollow usually did, with that small, flickering recognition that meant they'd heard it attached to some story or another. He just nodded, like it was information he was filing away. "Colton Hayes," he said. "I've got a ranch 8 miles out on the north pasture. One of my best working horses has been going lame on and off for 6 weeks. 2 different men have looked at it, and neither one told me anything useful." "What kind of lame?" "Hind left. Worse after hard ground, better after rest. No heat, no swelling you can see from the outside." Mara thought about it. "Navicular, maybe? Or a subsolar abscess that's been draining and sealing. You'd need to pull the shoe and look." He looked at her again with that same direct attention. "You available to come out and look?" She was aware suddenly of Caleb Purdy watching this exchange from across the stable, not saying anything, his coffee tin very still in his hand. "I'm not a veterinarian," she said again. "I know that. I'm asking if you know horses well enough to tell me what 2 supposed experts couldn't." It was not the strangest thing anyone had ever said to her, but it was the first time in a long while that someone had asked her a question that treated her answer like it might be worth something. "I can look," she said. She rode out to the Hayes Ranch 2 days later on a borrowed mare from Caleb's stable, following the directions Colton Hayes had left with Caleb, 8 miles north, left at the split cottonwood, through the creek crossing and up the grade to the main gate. It was a longer ride than she was used to, and she arrived stiff and a little short of breath from the heat, and the first thing she saw when she rode through the gate was 2 ranch hands leaning against the fence near the barn who stopped their conversation when they spotted her. She heard one of them say something low to the other. She didn't hear the words, but she knew the shape of them. She kept riding. The lame horse was a big chestnut gelding named Duke, and Mara spent 20 minutes with him before Colton Hayes came out of the ranch house and crossed the yard to the barn. She had already pulled the shoe on the hind left and was looking at the sole with a pick and the good light coming through the open barn door. "Find anything?" Hayes asked. "Small abscess, sealed over. It's been building pressure and releasing, which is why he goes lame and then seems fine." She showed him the spot. "You'll need to open it, flush it out, poultice it for a week. He'll be right in 10 days. Hayes crouched down and looked where she was pointing. "My foreman had a farrier out here last month. He didn't see that. He wasn't looking for it." "You were?" "I was looking for what was causing the problem." She set the hoof down carefully. "Most people look for the obvious thing. The obvious thing isn't always the thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and looked at her. Really looked at her. The same way he'd looked at the mare in Caleb's stable, without the layer of editing that most people put between what they saw and what they thought. "You've been in Red Hollow 3 years," he said. "Caleb Purdy speaks well of you. Caleb's a good man. He said you're the one who figured out his water pump last winter. Said the whole livery would have frozen up without it." Mara didn't say anything. She had fixed the pump because it needed fixing, and she'd figured out how, and the fact that Caleb had mentioned it to this man made her feel something complicated she couldn't name. "He also said the town has treated you badly," Hayes said. "He said it the way someone states a weather fact, no softness in it, no false sympathy. And that you've stayed anyway." "I didn't have anywhere else to go when I first came," she said. "After a while, staying stopped feeling like a choice. And now?" She looked out through the barn door at the wide, flat reach of the north pasture, the grass going golden in the afternoon light, the mountains sitting dark and permanent on the far horizon. It was a different view from what she saw from the narrow street in Red Hollow, where the buildings crowded the sky down to a strip of blue. "I don't know," she said. Honest, at least. She was tired of being anything else. Hayes looked at the same horizon she was looking at. "I need someone who can think," he said. "Not just take orders and swing a fence post. I've got men who can do that. What I don't have is someone who'll look at a problem and actually see it." He paused. "I'm offering you work, steady pay, a room in the house, decent, your own space. You'd be managing the practical side of things, supply, livestock health, problem solving. My foreman, Frank Doyle, handles the men. You'd handle everything else." The offer sat there between them like something breakable. Mara had been offered charity twice in Red Hollow. She had refused it both times because charity was another word for pity, and pity was another word for the person offering it needed to feel better about themselves at your expense. This didn't feel like charity. It felt like a business proposition, which was a different thing entirely. "Your men won't like it," she said. "Probably not. They'll make it hard. They'll try." He looked back at her. "You've been making it in a town that's made it hard for you for 3 years. I figured you had practice." It was not a kind thing to say exactly, but it was an honest one, and honesty from a stranger was rarer than kindness, and she found she valued it more. "When would you need an answer?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning is fine." She rode back to Red Hollow in the late afternoon with the sun going sideways across the flats and the shadow of the mare stretching out long and thin on the trail ahead of her. She thought about Floyd Garner and the bread skidding across his floor. She thought about Theodore Crane's face going pale at the depot. She thought about the long way home she'd been walking for 3 years, and about the life she'd built around the edges of a town that had never made room for her in the middle. She thought about what it meant to finally be asked for what she could actually do, rather than judged for what she looked like doing it. She told Caleb that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she liked best about him. "Hayes is a straight man," he said when she finished. Harder than most, but fair with it. Lost his wife 4 years ago. Ranch took a bad hit 2 winters back from the cold. Lost nearly a third of his cattle. He's been rebuilding. What do you think I should do? Caleb looked at her over his coffee. I think you already know what you're going to do. You're asking me because you want someone to tell you it's not foolish. Is it foolish? Plenty of things worth doing look foolish from the outside. He turned the coffee tin in his hands. Red Hollow's not done with being unkind to you. That's just the truth of it. And Hayes's men won't be easy. But Mara... He stopped. Started again. You've been making yourself small in this town for 3 years so people wouldn't have to be uncomfortable about the space you take up. And you're still the biggest person here by any measure that counts. Maybe it's time you went somewhere that had room to find that out. She left for the Hayes Ranch the next morning. She packed her 2 bags, the same ones she'd arrived with, and she loaded them onto the wagon Colton Hayes sent at first light, and she didn't look back at the main street of Red Hollow as they drove out. She would look back later, but not yet. What she didn't know, as the wagon rolled north through the early morning cold and the mountains came clear on the horizon, was that she was carrying into Colton Hayes's world something that no one in it had ever encountered before. Not his doubting foreman, not his resistant men, not the rival operator to the west who had already heard that Hayes had hired a woman no one else would take and was filing that information away for later use. She was carrying a mind that had spent 3 years watching everything carefully from the outside, learning the shape of things from the margins, understanding exactly how systems worked by watching them fail around her. She didn't know yet what that would mean, but the frontier had a way of answering questions you hadn't figured out how to ask yet. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, and the wagon moved on through the cold morning, and the ranch waited at the end of it like a place that had not yet decided what it would mean to her. The ranch hands didn't bother pretending they were glad to see her. Frank Doyle, Colton Hayes' foreman, was standing at the fence line near the main barn when the wagon pulled in that first morning, and he looked at Mara the way a man looks at weather he didn't predict and resents for proving his forecast wrong. He was maybe 50, thick through the chest, with a gray mustache he kept trimmed and hands that had the permanent dark creasing of outdoor work. He didn't offer to help with her bags. He just waited while Hayes climbed down from the wagon and came around to where Mara was already stepping down on her own. And when Hayes introduced them, Frank Doyle shook her hand with exactly the minimum pressure required to call it a handshake. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Doyle." That was the entirety of their first conversation. Hayes showed her to the room in the main house, east-facing, small but clean, with a window that looked out over the near pasture, and told her breakfast was at 5:30, dinner at 6, and that he'd introduce her to the operation properly the next morning. She unpacked her 2 bags, hung her 3 dresses on the hooks behind the door, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into its evening routine. Horses shifting in the barn, someone running a whetstone along a blade somewhere, the low exchange of male voices from the bunkhouse 40 yards away. She wasn't afraid exactly. She'd been the unwanted thing in a room too many times to be afraid of it anymore. But she was under no illusion about what the next weeks would look like. She was right. It started small, the way these things always do. The first morning at breakfast, the 2 ranch hands who ate in the main house, brothers named Pete and Roy Cassell, 20 and 23, who had been with Hayes for 2 years, sat at the far end of the table and found reasons not to look in her direction. Pete knocked over a pitcher of water reaching across the table rather than ask her to pass it. Roy answered every direct question she put to him with the shortest possible combination of words that still technically counted as a response. They weren't cruel about it. They were just doing the thing that men do when they want to make clear that you don't belong without going so far as to give you something specific to object to. Frank Doyle was more deliberate. On her second day, Hayes asked her to go with Frank to assess the condition of the north fence line, 3 miles of cedar posts and wire that had taken damage over the winter, and Frank saddled a horse for her without asking her preference, and then set a pace that he knew was too fast for comfort on unfamiliar ground. She kept up. He didn't acknowledge it. When she stopped twice to examine fence posts that showed signs of rot below the soil line, the kind of damage you couldn't see from horseback but that would fail under pressure, he waited with his horse turned slightly away, like he was doing her a courtesy by not watching her dismount. "These two need to come out," she said, marking them with a strip of cloth from her pocket. "Rot's at the base. They'll pull free in the first hard wind." "I'll make a note," Frank said in the tone of someone who was not going to make a note. "I'd like to mark the full section," she said. "Go slow and check each post at the soil line." He looked at her then. "That'll take all day." "Better all day now than a week restringing wire after cattle get through." He didn't argue. He also didn't help. He rode alongside her at a pace that communicated his opinion of the exercise while she dismounted and remounted at each post she wanted to check, and by the end of the afternoon they had marked 11 posts for replacement along a section that Frank had signed off as sound 3 weeks earlier in the ranch's maintenance log. She didn't point that out. She just handed Hayes the list when they got back. Hayes looked at it. Then he looked at Frank. Frank said, "Some of those might hold another season." "And some won't," Mara said. Hayes put the list in his desk drawer. "Get them replaced," he said to Frank. "All 11. Frank left the room without saying anything. Mara heard his boots on the porch steps, hard and deliberate, and she sat across from Hayes's desk and thought about how much harder everything was going to get now. "He's not going to like me," she said. "He doesn't have to like you." Hayes was already looking at the supply ledger on his desk. "He has to do his job. Those are different things. Men like Frank Doyle don't separate them as cleanly as you think." Hayes looked up. He studied her for a moment with that same direct attention she'd noticed in Caleb's stable. "You've dealt with men like Frank before." "I've dealt with a lot of things before," she said. "I'm telling you because you should know, not because I need you to fix it." He nodded once, slowly. "Fair enough." She went back to her room and sat on the bed and rubbed her thighs, which ached from the dismounting and remounting, and she did not let herself think about whether she'd made a mistake coming here. That particular thought was a hole in the ground, and she'd learned a long time ago that looking into it too long didn't help you figure out how to walk around it. She just had to keep moving. The work itself, at least, was genuine. Hayes's operation was large, 4,000 acres of mixed grassland and rough country, a main herd of 800 cattle, a remuda of 32 horses, and a crew of 11 men including Frank and the Castle brothers. The ranch had been profitable before the bad winter 2 years back, and Hayes had been methodical about rebuilding, but there were inefficiencies embedded in the operation that had become invisible through habit. Mara started seeing them in the first week. The hay storage was wrong. The main barn had 2 upper lofts, but the way feed was being moved, men carrying loads from the far loft first and working backward, meant they were spending an extra 40 minutes a day in unnecessary travel. She rearranged the rotation. Nobody thanked her. The time savings showed up in the work log within a week. The milking schedule for the 4 dairy cows Hayes kept for the house was being done twice a day at inconsistent intervals, which was stressing the animals and reducing yield. She put a proper schedule on the wall of the smaller barn. Roy Castle took it down the first day. She put it back up. He took it down again. She nailed it to the wall with 6 nails and didn't say a word about it, and after that it stayed. The water situation was the first thing that made the men actually pay attention, and it happened because of a problem, not because she was looking for credit. It was the 4th week of her time at the ranch, and the territory had gone dry in the way the frontier sometimes did in early summer. Not the prolonged drought that broke ranches, but the sharp 6-week dry stretch that stressed herds and shrunk the secondary water sources that most operations depended on between the seasonal rains. Hayes's main creek still ran, but the 2 secondary stock ponds that supplied the east pasture and the south ridge where the dry cows and young stock were kept had both dropped to levels that wouldn't sustain the animals through another 2 weeks of heat. Hayes called Frank and his senior hands together in the yard to talk about it, and the plan on the table was to move the South Ridge cattle to the main pasture, which would work for a week but would overgraze the main pasture and potentially create a larger problem down the road. Mara was not invited to this meeting. She was in the small barn when it happened, and she could hear the voices through the open window. She listened for 10 minutes. Then she went inside and got her hat and walked around the north side of the property by herself for 2 hours, following the land the way it ran, the small draws and the low spots, the places where the vegetation ran greener and darker than the surrounding grass, the depressions that held moisture longer than they should if there was nothing feeding them from below. She found it in a dry creek bed on the north edge of the east pasture, a seep spring that had gone unnoticed because the seasonal flow above it masked the smaller constant flow underneath. It was producing water. Not much, but enough. If you dug out the collection area and cleared the debris that had silted over the natural pooling point, maybe enough to carry the east pasture stock through the dry stretch without moving them. She went back and found Hayes alone on the porch. "There's a seep spring on the north edge of the east pasture," she said, "in the old creek bed near the split rock formation. It's been producing all along. The debris has silted up the natural pool. If you dig it out and put in a basic collection basin, you'd have enough to carry the east pasture through the dry weeks." Hayes looked at her. "You sure?" "I walked it. The vegetation pattern along that bed is different from the surrounding ground. Sedge grass and willow scrub, where there's no surface water reason for it. Something's feeding it from below." He was quiet. "Frank knows that east pasture ground better than anyone." "I know that." He didn't mention a seep spring. He might not have been looking for one, or it might have been covered over long enough that he stopped thinking about it. She kept her voice even. "I'm not saying he missed something he should have caught. I'm saying I saw it today because I was looking specifically for it." Hayes stood up from the porch. "Show me." She took him out there that afternoon. He crouched at the seep site for a long time, pressing his fingers into the mud, watching the slow dark movement of water collecting in the low point of the bed. Then he stood up and looked at her. "How long to dig it out and get a basin working?" "2 men in a day's work, maybe a day and a half." He looked at the mountains on the north horizon. "All right." Frank Doyle's face when Hayes told him was a precise and readable document. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw working slightly, and he looked at the ground the whole time Hayes spoke. And when Hayes finished, Frank said, "I walked that creek bed last summer." "I know you did," Hayes said. "Things change. The silt builds up." "She's been here 4 weeks." "Yes, she has." The silence between them was the kind that has a lot of words inside it, none of which were being said. "Pete and Roy can dig it out," Frank said finally. "Good," Hayes said. The basin was producing within 2 days. It wasn't a lot of water, but it was enough, and the east pasture cattle didn't need to be moved. Roy Castle, who spent the better part of a day digging under the afternoon sun, did not thank Mara when it was done. But that evening at dinner, he passed her the bread without being asked, and in the context of the Hayes Ranch in those weeks, that was something close to an olive branch. She was not fool enough to think the ground was shifting under her, but she noted it the way you note the first slight thaw in a long winter, carefully, without banking on it. The letter arrived at the end of the 5th week, and it changed the temperature of everything. Hayes brought it in from the mail run with his face set in the careful neutral expression he wore when he was working something out internally. He didn't say anything about it at dinner, but Mara had been watching his face long enough by then to know when it was carrying weight it wasn't showing. And that evening after the meal, she was still at the table with the supply ledger when he came back in from the porch and sat down and put the letter on the table. "Victor Aldine," he said. She'd heard the name once or twice already, from half conversations she'd caught between Frank and the senior hands. Aldine ran the Crossbar outfit to the west, 12,000 acres, twice Hayes's cattle count, and a habit of growing his operation by absorbing smaller ones around him when they became financially distressed. "What does he want?" she asked. "He's offering to buy out my water rights on the South Creek tributary." Hayes pressed the letter flat with one hand, offering good money for it. "What happens to your South pasture if you sell those rights? In a dry year, you can't run cattle there. And in a wet year? Wet year it'd be all right. Maybe." Mara looked at the letter without touching it. "He's buying the drought risk," she said. "Your South pasture becomes marginal land without that water, and marginal land is worth a fraction of what it is now. Next bad drought, if you're struggling, he comes back and offers to buy the land itself at the reduced value." Hayes said nothing. "The water rights aren't worth what he's offering on their own," she said. "He's buying a position, the right to squeeze later." The quiet between them had a different weight than the quiet with Frank Doyle. It was the quiet of a man who was working out whether he agreed with what he was hearing, not the quiet of a man deciding whether to dismiss it. "I had the same thought," he said. "So you're not selling?" "No." He folded the letter. "But Aldine doesn't take no gracefully. He has a way of finding other angles." What kind of angles? The kind that are hard to trace back to him. Hayes put the letter in his shirt pocket. He's run 3 smaller outfits off their land in the last 5 years. 2 of them through water disputes that somehow always found in his favor. 1 through a fire that nobody could prove was set. She let that sit for a moment. You think he'll come after the ranch? I think he'll come after the reasons the ranch is standing, Hayes said. He looked at her directly. Which lately includes you. She wasn't surprised exactly. She'd understood from the Seep Spring conversation onward that success here was not going to be invisible, but hearing it said plainly that she had made herself a target by being useful, settled into her chest with a particular weight she'd felt before. It was the weight of being visible in a world where visibility was dangerous, and she had spent years trying to make herself small enough to avoid it. She was done making herself small. Then we'd better make sure everything we're doing is documented, she said. Supply records, water agreements, maintenance logs, fence assessments, everything. If Aldine wants to come after the operation, he should find a paper trail that goes nowhere useful for him. Hayes studied her. That's not the answer I expected. What answer did you expect? Oh, fear, maybe. I'm not afraid, she said. I just find that fear is more useful when you're doing something with it. He almost smiled. She wasn't sure because she wasn't entirely used to reading his face yet, but something moved in the corner of his mouth that could have been that. All right, he said. Show me what a good paper trail looks like. They worked at the table for 2 hours that evening, pulling records from Hayes's desk that had been kept sporadically and inconsistently, the way of a man who understood his own operation intuitively but hadn't anticipated needing to prove it to someone outside. Mara organized them into a running log by category: water access, fence maintenance, livestock health, supply inventory, labor accounts. She showed Hayes what was missing and what they needed to make current. He was a faster learner than she expected, and he had the businessman's instinct for where the vulnerabilities were once she explained the structure. By the time the lamp oil was running low, they had the beginning of something solid. Frank Doyle, coming in late from a check of the bunkhouse, stopped in the doorway of the main room and looked at the 2 of them bent over the table with papers spread between them. His face did the thing it always did, the small, careful shuddering of whatever he actually thought, and he said good night and went down the hall to his room. Mara heard his door close and thought about what he had seen and what he would make of it. And she thought about Victor Aldine's letter sitting in Hayes's shirt pocket, and she thought about the long chain of cause and effect that was already in motion. The seep spring, the fence posts, the water rights offer, the paper trail she'd just started building. And she understood that she was no longer on the margins of anything. She was inside something now. In it, in the way that meant she could be hurt by it. She went back to her room and sat by the window for a while in the dark, listening to the ranch quiet down around her. The last horses settling, the bunkhouse lamp going out, the high distant sound of something calling from the dark hills to the north. She was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had been performing competence for an audience that was actively rooting against her all day, every day, for weeks. It was a different tired from the weariness of the livery stable in Red Hollow, and she was still working out whether it was better or worse. She thought about Caleb Purdy and his upturned crate and his coffee tin, and the way he'd said you've been making yourself small in this town for 3 years. She thought about the bread on Floyd Garner's floor. She thought about the look on Roy Castle's face when he'd passed her the bread at dinner. Small things. But the frontier was built out of small things accumulated, and she had learned to read them the way you read weather. Not any single sign, but the pattern of signs together, the slow shift in pressure that told you something was changing before you could see it with your eyes. Something was changing here. She couldn't yet tell in which direction, and she was too experienced with disappointment to assume the change was in her favor. But it was moving, and she was moving with it, which was more than she could have said 6 weeks ago in Red Hollow, with bread on a dirty floor in front of her boots. She was still thinking when she fell asleep, still dressed, with the lamp unlit and the window open and the night air coming cool off the north pasture and the ranch breathing its steady, ordinary breath all around her. She did not dream of anything in particular. She hadn't in years. She just slept and woke before dawn and got up and went to work. The rumors reached the ranch before the storm did. Mara first heard them from Pete Castle, who was not trying to tell her. He was talking to his brother Roy in the small barn while she was in the back stall checking on a heifer with a swollen fetlock, and he didn't know she was there. She heard her own name, and then she heard the word Aldine, and then she heard Pete say low and flat, "They're saying she's got Hayes twisted around, that she's the one really running things, and he's too blind to see she's working an angle." Roy said, "What angle?" "Don't know, just what they're saying in town." She stayed very still until they left. Then she finished checking the heifer's leg, wrapped it clean, and stood up and pressed her back against the stall wall for a moment with her eyes closed. Not from hurt, exactly. She'd heard worse, but the specific shape of this one was familiar in a way that made her tired. The idea that a woman who proved useful must be running some kind of game, because the alternative was admitting she was simply capable. And that was the version people in places like Red Hollow found hardest to swallow. She told Hayes that evening. She had learned in the weeks since the letter from Victor Aldine that keeping him informed was not just courtesy, it was strategy. He needed to know the shape of what was moving against them before it arrived, not after. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Aldine." "That would be my guess. He's got 2 men in town who drink at the saloon and talk to everyone. It's how he operates." Hayes set down the pen he'd been holding. "He can't come at the water rights directly after I turned him down, so he comes at the credibility of whoever's protecting them. Which is me now. Which is you now." He looked at her steadily. "Does that change anything for you?" She thought about it honestly, which she figured he deserved. "No," she said, "but I want it on the record that I told you it was coming, for when it gets worse." "You think it'll get worse." "It always gets worse before it stops." He picked up his pen again. "Then we keep building the record and we don't flinch." She nodded and went back to the supply ledger she'd been updating, and neither of them said anything else about it, and that was the right thing. There was nothing useful to be said that hadn't been said. The only answer to what Aldine was doing was to keep doing the work, and to do it well enough that the record spoke louder than the rumors eventually. But eventually was a long way away, and the weeks between now and then were going to cost something. Frank Doyle came to her 3 days later, not in front of anyone. He found her alone near the water trough behind the main barn in the early morning, before the rest of the crew was properly moving, and he stood with his arms crossed and looked at her with his face doing none of its usual shuddering. He was letting her see what he thought for once. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I'm going to say it once. All right? I don't know what your situation is with Hayes. I don't know what you're planning or what you're after. What I know is that the men are unsettled, and unsettled men make mistakes, and mistakes on a working ranch get people hurt." He paused. "I've been foreman here 6 years. I've kept this crew together through bad winters and worse years. I'm not going to let one season come apart because the hands don't know what they're supposed to think about you." Mara looked at him. She could feel the anger in what he was saying. Not personal anger exactly, but the anger of a man who has built something over years and feels it threatened. She understood that anger. She didn't like being on the receiving end of it, but she understood it. "What are you asking me to do?" she said. "I'm asking you to be clear about what you are here. Not to Hayes, to the men. Because right now they've got one story coming from Aldine's people in town and no story from you, and nature fills a vacuum." She was quiet for a moment. "You want me to explain myself to men who've been making my life difficult since I arrived. I want you to stop letting the wrong people tell your story." That landed differently than she expected. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something under the 6 years of foreman's authority and the crossed arms and the careful shuddering, something that might have been, against all reasonable expectation, a reluctant recognition. He still didn't like her. She was fairly sure he still resented her presence here in the way that people resent the disruption of things they've grown accustomed to. But Frank Doyle was, underneath everything, a practical man, and practicality had apparently just edged ahead of pride. "How do you suggest I do that?" she asked. "Work," he said, "where they can see it. Stop fixing things quietly and letting Hayes announce it. Fix things where the men are watching." He uncrossed his arms. "They respect work. It's the one thing that doesn't have a different rule for different people out here." She thought about the fence posts, how she'd marked them while he rode alongside with his face turned away. She thought about the seep spring, found alone on a walk while they met without her. She thought about 2 hours at the table with Hayes and the lamp burning low, and Frank in the doorway seeing whatever he decided to see. "I'm not going to perform," she said, "if that's what you mean. I'm not asking you to perform. I'm asking you to stop working around us and work with us." He looked out at the pasture. "There's a difference." She stayed with that for a long moment. It was the most honest exchange she'd had with Frank Doyle since arriving, and she was not going to ruin it by being defensive. "All right," she said. He nodded once and walked away, and that was the second conversation she'd had with Frank that amounted to something real, which she figured was twice more than most people got. She started working differently after that, not more visibly for the sake of it. She drew the line at performance. But she stopped going around the crew when she was solving problems and started going through them. When she noticed the hay rotation issue reasserting itself because old habits were hard to break, she didn't go fix it alone and report to Hayes. She went to the hand responsible for the loft schedule, a quiet man named Gus, who'd been with the ranch 3 years, and she asked him to walk her through how he was doing it and why. And Gus, who had the instincts of a man who'd been blamed for enough things he hadn't caused, was defensive at first, but when she explained what she'd noticed and asked his opinion on fixing it, something shifted. "Huh," he said, looking at the rotation schedule on the loft wall. "Yeah, that's been adding time. What would you change?" He told her. His solution was slightly different from hers, and in one respect better, because he knew the loft dimensions from years of working them in the dark. She said so. He looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language, then looked back at the schedule, then made the change he'd suggested. It was the same with the fencing crew. When 2 of the younger hands were restringing the north section where the rotted posts had been replaced, she went out with them and spent a morning working alongside them, not directing, just working. She was slower on some of it, faster on parts that required patience and careful tension reading, and by noon one of them, a kid named Dale, who couldn't have been more than 18, was asking her questions about tension ratios without seeming to notice he was doing it. She didn't say anything about it to Hayes. She didn't have to. He watched his crew with the same careful attention he gave most things, and after 2 weeks he said to her one evening simply, "Whatever you changed, it's working." "Frank gave me some advice," she said. Hayes raised an eyebrow, which was approximately the most surprised she'd seen him look. "Did he?" "He did." She went back to the ledger. He was right. The storm announced itself 4 days before it arrived, if you knew how to read the sky. Mara had grown up in country that was harder on weather than the valley around Red Hollow, and she recognized the specific quality of the light on the afternoon she first saw the far clouds building to the northwest. Not the quick anvil heads of a summer thunderstorm, but the long, flat-bottomed shelf of something systematic, something that was going to take its time and mean it. She told Hayes that evening, "We've got 3 or 4 days before that system comes through. It's going to be serious." He looked at the sky from the porch. "You sure?" "No, but I'd rather be wrong and prepared than right and caught short." He called Frank in. The 3 of them sat at the table and went through the ranch's exposure point by point. The main herd was on the south pasture, which had reasonable natural shelter in the draws, but nothing engineered. The young stock and dry cows were on the south ridge, exposed on 2 sides to the northwest wind. The hay supply in the main barn was adequate, but the secondary supply in the field shed on the east pasture was vulnerable to flooding if the creek rose, which it would if this system was what Mara thought it was. Frank listened to all of it with his arms on the table and his face doing something she'd started to be able to read. Not shuddered now, but calculating, running the same math she was running, checking her conclusions against his own knowledge of the ground. "South Ridge is the problem," he said. "If the creek comes up and the ground goes soft, we can't move the cattle off there in the middle of the storm. Have to get them down beforehand. And the hay in the field shed needs to come in," she said. "All of it. We can't risk losing that supply." "That's 2 days of work in 4 days," Frank said. He said it to Hayes, but he wasn't excluding her from the conversation the way he used to. "Then we start tomorrow," Hayes said. The next 2 days were the hardest physical work Mara had done since her worst winters at Caleb's livery, and they were harder because she was doing them alongside men who were working at the edge of their capacity and who could not be allowed to see her fall behind. She didn't fall behind. She found the specific places in the work where she was actually useful, organizing the hay loading so that the wagon could be packed efficiently rather than just full, managing the cattle movement off the South Ridge by reading the herd's behavior and positioning herself and the horses in the right places to channel movement without panic. And she stayed in those places and did them as well as she could, and tried not to think about the ache in her knees from the cold or the fact that she'd slept 4 hours in 2 nights. On the third day, the sky went the color of old pewter and the temperature dropped 15 degrees by noon. The wind came first, ahead of the rain, pulling at the newly stacked hay in the main barn and sending the horses sideways in the yard. By mid-afternoon, the rain started, and it was not the rain of a passing summer storm. It came in curtains, horizontal, with a weight to it that drummed on the barn roof like something with intent. Hayes was in the east pasture with 3 of the men when it broke, checking on a section of the fence line that Mara had flagged 2 days earlier as potentially weakened by the softening ground. She was in the main barn with Gus and Dale, securing the last of the hay that had been brought in from the field shed, when Pete Castle came in through the barn door soaked to the skin with his hat in his hand. "Fence on the east section came down," he said. 2 posts pulled clean out of the ground. Boss was trying to get the temporary wire up and the horse spooked and threw him. Mara set down the rope she was holding. "How bad?" "He's up, walking, but he took a hit on his left side when he came down. Frank thinks he's cracked something." She was already moving. She told Gus and Dale to finish the securing and not to leave the barn until the wind dropped, and she went out into the rain, which hit her like a wall. The east pasture was a 1/4 mile from the main barn, and the ground between was already soft enough that each step sank an inch, and the rain was coming so hard that she could see maybe 20 feet in any direction. She followed the fence line because she knew it, and it was the only reliable guide in the visibility. She found them at the downed section, Hayes on his feet but bent slightly at the torso in the way of someone guarding damaged ribs, Frank on one side of him, a hand named Cal on the other. 2 posts had indeed pulled out, and a section of wire had snapped under the pressure, and through the gap Mara could see the shapes of cattle already pushing toward the opening with the blind, stupid insistence of frightened animals looking for movement. "How many got through?" she said. 30, maybe 40 head, Frank said, before we got the gap blocked with the wagon. She looked at the flooded ground beyond the fence, the way the water was moving across the low sections, the direction the cattle would have gone based on the wind and terrain. The creek was to the east, already audible over the rain, a sound it didn't usually make, a sound that meant it was running high and fast. "They'll push east," she said, "toward the creek. We have to get ahead of them." Hayes straightened up with an effort that cost him something. "I'll go." "No," she said. It came out flat and immediate. "You've got cracked ribs at minimum. You go in that mud and take another fall and we're dealing with something worse." She looked at Frank. "Who's available?" Frank ran the count without hesitating. "Cal and me, Pete, Roy's with the South Herd. That's 4 of us," she said. Frank looked at her for 1 second, the same assessing look she'd been receiving from him for weeks, but with something different behind it now, something she didn't have time to examine. "2 go east to cut them off before the creek," he said. 2 push from behind. "I'll go east," she said. "You know that ground?" "I know water. I know how it moves and where they'll bunch." She looked at him steadily. "I'll go east with Cal. You and Pete push from behind and keep them off the fence line." Frank Doyle made the decision in the time it takes to blink. "Go," he said. She and Cal went east at a pace that was not quite running. Running in that ground, in that visibility, was how you broke an ankle. And she was navigating by the sound of the creek and the slope of the ground underfoot and the way the water was sheeting, all of it red through her feet and her ears because her eyes were nearly useless in the rain. Cal was 20 yards to her right, and she could hear him but not see him clearly, and she trusted him to hold his line because there was no alternative. They got ahead of the cattle. She heard them before she saw them. That specific low constant sound of a frightened herd, the shuffling and the occasional bellow, the sound of 40 animals pressing against each other. She came around a rise in the ground, and there they were, 20 yards from the creek bank, the water behind them running dark and fast and nothing between them and it. She did not think about the footing or the visibility or the fact that she was alone with one ranch hand against 40 head of frightened cattle in a flooded pasture in the dark middle of a serious storm. She thought about what the cattle needed: pressure from the right angle to turn them, not startle them, not scatter them, just redirect the mass of them the way you redirect water in a channel, not by stopping it, but by changing its shape. She went wide left. She got upwind of them. She moved in the particular way she'd learned from years of watching Caleb Purdy work difficult horses, slowly, taking up space without threatening, letting the animals feel a presence that had authority without aggression. And the herd, which had been pressing toward the creek with that mindless, frightened momentum, felt something change at the left edge of its movement and began slowly to turn. Cal had come around on the right. He read what she was doing and matched it, and for 10 minutes in the rain, in the dark, and the high rushing sound of the flooded creek, the two of them worked the cattle the way you work something that could kill you if you got it wrong, with absolute attention and no room for anything else. The herd turned, not cleanly, not without a dozen near breaks where individual animals tried to split, and she or Cal had to move fast to block them. But it turned, and it stayed turned, and by the time Frank and Pete arrived from behind, the cattle were moving west, away from the creek, back toward the broken fence section and the wagon that was blocking it. Getting them back through the gap took another hour, in the rain, with the ground getting worse under every step. Frank worked beside her for that hour without saying a word, and she worked beside him, and they were two people doing a hard, necessary thing together, which was a different relationship than they'd had that morning. Hayes was still at the fence when they got the cattle back through. He had refused to go in, which she could have predicted, and he was standing in the rain with his arm pressed against his left side and his face the color of the sky. And he watched the last of the cattle come through the gap and did not say anything immediately. She went to him. She looked at the way he was standing, the specific angle of his arm against his ribs. "You need to go in," she said. "I know. Now, not after you check the fence." He looked at her. "The fence? We'll handle the fence." She held his eyes until he stopped arguing, which took longer than it should have, because he was that kind of man. "Frank, Cal, get him to the house." Frank moved to Hayes' right side without being asked twice. That was the moment she noted, not dramatically, just noted, the way you note a shift in the weather, that Frank Doyle was doing what she said. She stayed at the fence with Pete and Roy, who had come in from the south herd once the worst of the cattle movement was secure, and they worked in the rain to get temporary wire across the gap, driving stakes by hand into ground that was soft enough to swallow them wrong and had to be reset twice before they held. Pete Castle worked beside her without commentary, without the sideways looks, just worked, and when the last section of temporary wire was tied off, he looked at what they'd done and said shortly, "That'll hold till morning." "Good enough," she said. They went in. The rain was still coming, heavier now, and the lightning was finding the hills to the north with the systematic indifference of something much larger than any of them. And Mara walked back across the sodden east pasture in the dark and thought about Victor Aldine and his rumors and the bread on Floyd Garner's floor and Theodore Crane's face going pale at the depot, and she thought about what Frank Doyle had said 3 weeks ago: "Stop letting the wrong people tell your story." And she thought about the 40 head of cattle that were back inside the fence because she had gone into a flooded pasture in the dark and done the thing that needed doing. She was not triumphant about it. She was wet and cold, and her knees were in a state she was going to have to deal with in the morning. And the storm was still going, and the fence was temporary, and Hayes was in the house with cracked ribs, and the full accounting of the damage wasn't done yet. There was nothing triumphant about any of it. But she had been tested by this ground, and she had not broken. And whatever the men of the Hayes Ranch thought about her when they woke up tomorrow, it would be informed by what they had watched her do tonight, and that was a different starting point than any morning that had come before it. She went inside. She changed her wet clothes. She sat down at the table with a cup of coffee that was too hot to drink and the supply ledger open in front of her, and she started making notes about what the storm had taken and what it had left and what would need to be done in the morning, because the morning was coming regardless, and someone needed to be ready for it. Outside, the rain kept coming. The creek ran high and the lightning worked its way east, and the ranch held, in the way that things hold when they've been built right and maintained right and fought for by people who understood that the frontier did not give anything away. Not the land, not the water, not the belonging, not any of it, without extracting the full price first. She was still writing when the lamp oil ran low, and she trimmed the wick and kept writing, and the storm moved on across the dark hills and left the world wet and rearranged and waiting for whatever came next. The morning after the storm came in gray and waterlogged, and the damage showed itself slowly the way damage always does. Not all at once, but piece by piece, each new thing adding to the account. The temporary fence on the east section had held through the night, which was the first piece of news Mara had when she went out before breakfast, her knees stiff from the cold and the previous day's work, her boots still damp from the hours in the flooded pasture. Pete Castle was already there when she arrived, checking the stakes she'd driven in the dark, and he looked up when she came and said, "Held clean, not a post shifted." "Good," she said. "We'll need permanent repair by end of week before the ground dries hard around the bad footing." "I know it," he said, and went back to work. That was the full extent of the conversation, but it was a different exchange than any they'd had in the first weeks, and she registered it without comment and moved on to the next thing, because there was always a next thing, and standing still to appreciate small victories was how you missed what was coming. The field shed on the east pasture had taken water. Not catastrophically. The hay they'd brought in before the storm was safe in the main barn, which was the decision that mattered. But the shed itself had a section of roof that had lifted in the wind and let in 6 hours of rain, and the ground inside was sodden, and the structure's east wall had a lean to it that hadn't been there before. Gus found her at the shed mid-morning, and they stood together looking at the wall. "She'll come down in the next hard wind," Gus said. "Yes, she will." Mara walked the perimeter of the shed, pressing at the base of the east wall with her boot, feeling where the foundation posts had moved in the soft ground. Foundation posts shifted. The wall's not load-bearing on its own anymore. We rebuild or we pull it down. She looked at the shed's position on the pasture, the way it sat relative to the prevailing wind, the way water collected in the low ground to its north. It had been built in the wrong place to begin with. She'd thought that since her first week, positioned for convenience of the original construction rather than for the long-term protection of what it stored. "We pull it down and rebuild 20 yards south on the high ground," she said. "Same thing will happen again in the same spot." Gus squinted at the new location she was indicating. "That's more work." "It's one rebuild instead of two." He thought about it, nodded. "I'll tell Frank." He said it naturally, the way you say you'll tell the foreman about a decision made in the field, not as a challenge or a redirect. She noticed that too, and kept moving. Hayes was in the main house under the stern care of a neighbor woman named Mrs. Aldis, who had come out from Red Hollow when word reached town that the storm had put the ranch's owner down. She was 60-something, practical, and unsentimental, and she had bound Hayes's ribs herself and informed him that he would stay horizontal for 3 days minimum, or she would bind him to the bed. And from the expression on Hayes's face when Mara came in to give her morning report, he believed her completely. He was propped against the headboard with the ledgers Mara had brought him and a cup of something medicinal that smelled terrible, and he looked like a man who was furious at his own body for its inconvenient timing. "How bad?" he said when she came in. "Manageable." She sat in the chair beside the door where she'd been giving him reports since Mrs. Aldis had decreed the main room off limits for ranch business. "The east fence will be permanent by end of week. The field shed needs to come down and be rebuilt on the high ground. The south herd is intact. South pasture took some erosion in the draws, but nothing that won't recover. Main barn is sound. We lost 2 sections of the creek bank on the east edge. The water cut into the soil there, but it's not affecting the water access." Hayes listened to all of it with his eyes steady on her face, the way he listened when he was translating what he heard into decisions. "The shed rebuild. How long?" "A week, with enough hands. I'd rather do it right than fast." "What does Frank say?" "I haven't talked to him about the timeline yet. He's managing the fence crew this morning." Hayes nodded. Then he said, "What about the cattle that went through the east fence last night? Full count?" 38 head, all recovered. 3 showed some stress. I want to keep them in the near pasture for a few days and watch them, but I don't think we lost any condition that won't come back." 38, he said. He was quiet a moment. "You went out in that." It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said. "Frank told me." He looked at the window, the gray post-storm light coming through it. He said you read the ground and got ahead of them before they hit the creek. Cal was there too. Frank and Pete pushed from behind. I know who was there, Hayes said, with a patience that told her he was not interested in her deflecting. I'm telling you what Frank told me, which was that without you reading the ground the way you did, we'd have lost cattle in that creek. Maybe all 38. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, she could hear the crew moving around the yard, the specific sounds of a ranch returning to its routine after being knocked sideways. Purposeful, slightly ragged, the sounds of people who were tired but not broken. He told you that, she said. He did. Frank Doyle doesn't say things he doesn't mean. You know that about him by now. She did know that. It was one of the things she'd come to respect about Frank in the weeks since he'd found her at the water trough and told her to stop letting the wrong people tell her story. He was hard, and he was territorial, and he'd made her life difficult in ways both direct and indirect, but he wasn't dishonest. And in the accounting of the Hayes Ranch, honesty was worth more than warmth. How are your ribs? She asked. Terrible, he said. What else? She gave him the rest of the morning's account and left him to Mrs. Aldous and his medicinal tea, and went back out to the yard where the work was waiting, because it always was. The news from Red Hollow came 3 days after the storm, carried by a rider named Tomas, who brought mail and supplies out from the town twice a week. He arrived in the early afternoon with a canvas bag and the particular expression of someone who is carrying information they're not sure how to deliver. And he found Mara in the yard rather than Hayes, which suited him, she could tell, because what he had to say was about her. Miss Whitfield, he handed over the mailbag. There's talk in town. About the storm, and about what happened out here. What kind of talk? He pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands. Mixed kind. Some people heard that you managed the rescue of the cattle, that you went out in the flood. He paused. And there's some other talk, coming from the direction of Aldine's people. What are they saying? He looked at the hat. That Hayes is laid up and you've taken over the ranch, that you've been running things for months, and Hayes doesn't know half of what you've changed, that you're building something for yourself out here at his expense. He finally looked up at her. I don't believe it. I'm telling you because you should know what's circulating. She thanked him. She brought the mailbag inside and set it on Hayes's bed, where he was still being kept horizontal by Mrs. Aldis's firm insistence, and she told him what Tomas had said, the same way she'd told him about the earlier rumors, plainly, without editorializing. Hayes's expression during this recounting was the same one he wore when he was reading supply figures that didn't add up. He's escalating, he said. Yes. Because the storm gave him an opening. I'm down, the operation's been disrupted, people are talking. He reached for the mailbag with his good arm. He'll make a move while things are uncertain. What kind of move? I don't know yet, but the rumors are preparation. You soften the ground before you drive the post. He went through the mail and stopped at one envelope that he looked at for a moment before opening. His face did not change while he read it, which was the tell she'd learned for news that was serious. He handed her the letter. It was from a solicitor in the county seat, representing Victor Aldine. It claimed that a water access agreement from 7 years ago, predating Hayes's purchase of the property, gave Aldine rights to the South Creek tributary during drought conditions, and that the recent dry weeks constituted such a condition, and that Aldine intended to file a formal claim with the county land office unless the matter could be resolved through negotiation. She read it twice. This agreement, she said. Do you know about it? No, which means either it doesn't exist or it was buried in the property transfer records 7 years ago and nobody caught it. He looked at the ceiling. Or Aldine has someone who's very good at creating documents that look old. The land office would have the original filing if it's legitimate. Yes, they would. Then we go to the land office and we look. She set the letter on the bed beside him. Everything we've been documenting for the ranch, the water access records, the maintenance logs, the supply history, all of it establishes the pattern of use. Pattern of use matters in water rights disputes. An agreement that was never exercised for 7 years is going to be hard to enforce, even if it's real. Hayes looked at her. You know water law. I know enough. The frontier runs on water and the law around it. She met his eyes. "We need a lawyer. Do you have one?" "In Millhaven, Douglas Crane. He handled the property purchase." "Can he handle a water rights dispute?" "He's the best in 2 counties." "Then we write to him today." She stood up. "And I'm going to the land office in Red Hollow tomorrow and looking at the original filing records myself. If that agreement exists, I want to see it before Aldine's solicitor gets to characterize it for us." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Mara." It was the first time he'd used her given name without the miss in front of it. She registered it without reacting. "This is going to get worse before it stops," he said. "You told me that weeks ago about the rumors. You were right. This is the escalation. Aldine doesn't just want the water rights. If he can destabilize this ranch financially and reputationally at the same time, he can pick up the land at a fraction of value when I'm forced to sell." He paused. "I want you to know what you're standing in the middle of, because you didn't sign on for a legal fight with the largest ranch operator in the county." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the bread on Floyd Garner's floor. She thought about what it had cost her to take the long way home for 3 years, making herself small so that other people wouldn't have to be uncomfortable. She thought about 38 cattle that were alive and in the south pasture because she had read a flooded piece of ground in the dark. "I didn't sign on for a lot of things that turned out to be part of the job," she said. "I'm still here." He nodded. That was all. But it was enough. She rode into Red Hollow the next morning on a horse Frank Doyle had saddled for her without being asked, which was a small thing that meant something larger than itself. The town looked the same as it always had from the North Road. The cluster of buildings sitting low against the flat ground, the water tower, the church steeple, the long straight line of the main street. She had spent 3 years walking those streets at the margins, taking the long way to avoid the people who made those years smaller. Now she rode down the center of the main street on a good horse with a purpose, and if people on the boardwalk looked up and recognized her, she didn't look away. The land office was at the end of Main Street in a wooden building that smelled of old paper and dust and the particular dry smell of documents that haven't been touched in years. The clerk was a middle-aged man named Haskell, who looked at her over his glasses with the mild suspicion of a man who spent his days among records, and had learned that people who came to look at them usually wanted something complicated. "Hayes Ranch," she said. "I need to see the original property filing and any attached agreements or easements recorded at the time of purchase. 7 years ago." "What name on the purchase?" "Colton Hayes. Previous owner would have been a man named Whitmore. Whitmore to Hayes, 7 years back." Haskell went into the back room. She waited. The office was quiet except for the sound of someone's horse outside and the distant noise of the street. She stood at the counter and kept her face neutral and her hands still, which was the posture she had developed over years of waiting in rooms where people were deciding how much of her time they thought was worth respecting. Haskell came back with a ledger and a folder of documents bound with cord. He put them on the counter and stepped back, which she understood was his version of cooperation. He wasn't going to help her, but he wasn't going to prevent her either. She went through the documents carefully. Property description, survey records, purchase agreement, transfer deed. She read each page fully, not scanning, because scanning was how you missed the things someone wanted you to miss. 20 minutes in, she found what she was looking for, or more precisely, what she was not finding. There was no water rights agreement. There was no easement, no attached agreement, no notation of any kind regarding the South Creek tributary or any other water access. The property had transferred clean, with full water rights included in the acreage description, unencumbered. She made careful notes of the document numbers, the filing dates, the specific language of the water rights description in the transfer deed. She wrote it all down in the small notebook she carried in her coat pocket, in her careful, even handwriting, every number exact. Then she asked Haskell if she could have copies of the relevant pages made. He said the office didn't make copies. She asked if she could bring her own paper and transcribe. He said she could. She spent another hour at the counter transcribing the key passages word for word, and when she was done, she thanked Haskell and went back out into the Main Street sun. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment with her notebook in her hand and the sun on her face and the sounds of Red Hollow around her. Across the street, she could see the front of Floyd Garner's dry goods store, the door standing open, the dark interior behind it. A woman came out of the store with a wrapped parcel and walked past without looking at her. A man on horseback went by, nodded at her briefly, rode on. She thought about the document she had just read. She thought about Victor Aldine and his solicitor's letter claiming an agreement that did not exist in the county records. And she thought about the 2 ranch operators Aldine had displaced through water disputes that somehow always found in his favor. And she thought about what that meant, not just for the Hayes Ranch, but for every smaller operation in the valley that Aldine had been maneuvering around for years. She rode back to the ranch with the notebook in her coat pocket and the specific, steady feeling of someone who has found the thing they were looking for and knows exactly what to do with it. Frank was in the yard when she came in, working with Gus on the plans for the field shed rebuild. He looked up when she rode through the gate, and she could tell from the way he looked that he wanted to know what she'd found and was waiting for her to offer it rather than asking. She dismounted and handed the reins to Dale and said to Frank, "There's no agreement. The land office has nothing. The property transferred with full unencumbered water rights 7 years ago. I have the document numbers and the specific language." Frank was quiet for a moment. Aldine's fabricating it. Or he thinks Hayes doesn't know what's in the original filing and won't go look. She pulled the notebook from her pocket. Either way, we have the record. Douglas Crane can file an affidavit with the county land office stating the chain of title. Aldine's solicitor will have nothing to argue against a clean title record. Frank looked at the notebook. He had the expression of a man running a calculation in his head and arriving at an answer that required him to update something he'd believed before. "When you came here," he said, "I thought you were going to be a problem. I know you did. I was wrong about the kind of problem." It was not an apology. Frank Doyle didn't traffic in apologies any more than he trafficked in unnecessary words. But it was an acknowledgement, which from him was worth more than most people's apologies, and she understood that. "I need to write to Crane today," she said. "Can you have someone ride to Millhaven tomorrow?" "I'll go myself," Frank said, which told her something. She wrote the letter to Douglas Crane that evening at the table in the main house, with Hayes propped in his chair at Mrs. Aldis's grudging permission. His 3rd day of required rest, which he had declared sufficient regardless of the doctor's opinion, and which Mrs. Aldis had responded to with the expression of a woman who has heard that before. Hayes read each paragraph of the letter as she finished it, and twice he suggested changes to the legal framing that she incorporated, because he knew Crane's manner, and she didn't. The letter set out the chain of title, referenced the document numbers from the land office filing, specified that no water agreement or easement of any kind appeared in the county records, and requested that Crane file a formal title affidavit and respond to Aldine's solicitor on the basis of the recorded evidence. When it was done, Hayes read the final version and set it down. "This is good," he said. "This is thorough." "Aldine's letter was prepared," she said. "He expected you to respond from uncertainty. We're responding from the record." Hayes looked at her. The lamp was low, and his face was tired. 3 days of enforced rest had not rested him so much as frustrated him, and the frustration was showing in the lines around his eyes. But underneath it was something else, something she'd been seeing more clearly in the weeks since the storm, since the conversation about the letter and the rumors and the decision to keep building the paper trail. "You've been thinking about this longer than I have," he said. "The documentation, the land office. You knew we'd need it." "I thought we might," she said carefully. "That's not an accident. That's preparation." He leaned back in the chair carefully, compensating for his ribs. "I need to ask you something." "All right. What do you want from this ranch?" The question sat between them in the lamplight. She turned her pen in her fingers and thought about how to answer it honestly, because it deserved honesty, and so did he. "I want to do work that matters," she said. "I want to be somewhere that the work I do stays done, and the problems I solve stay solved, and at the end of a season I can look at what the operation is and know I had a part in making it what it is." She paused. "I spent 3 years in Red Hollow doing work that disappeared. I fixed Caleb's pump, and Caleb was grateful, but the town forgot it the next day. I want somewhere that keeps a record, not for my pride, because work should leave a mark, or it doesn't mean much." Hayes was quiet for a long time, long enough that the lamp guttered once in a draft from the window. "I'd like to offer you a share," he said. "Not wages. A stake in the operation, 10%, with the option to build that over time depending on how the ranch grows." She was still. "That's not what you hired me for." "No, it's what the work warrants." He looked at her directly. "Frank told me what you did in the flooded pasture, not just the cattle. He told me that when he needed to make a decision in the dark and the rain, he looked at you. He didn't look at Pete or Cal or anyone with 10 years on this land. He looked at you." He paused. "That's not something I can compensate with a monthly wage." She thought about Theodore Crane's face at the depot. She thought about Floyd Garner's floor. She thought about what Caleb Purdy had said. "You've been making yourself small in this town for 3 years," and about how it had felt to hear it, the accuracy of it, the way it landed in the chest like something you'd known for a long time but hadn't let yourself say. "I'd want it in writing," she said, "properly drawn up. Not just a handshake." "Of course. And I want it on record that the stake is for the operational work, not for anything personal. So there's no confusion later about what I am here and why." Hayes looked at her steadily. "There isn't any confusion on my end about that. There might be on other people's ends. Aldine's going to make more noise when we respond to his solicitor. I want the arrangement clean and documented so there's nothing for him to grab onto." "Agreed," Hayes said. "I'll have Crane draw it up when Frank delivers the letter." She nodded. She put the pen down. Outside the window, the night had gone fully dark, and somewhere across the north pasture one of the horses was moving in the near field, a sound she'd learned to find reassuring, the quiet nighttime movement of animals that were fed and watered and not afraid. She stayed at the table for a while after Hayes went back to his room, not working, just sitting with the lamp burning low and the sounds of the ranch around her. She thought about the 11 months she'd been at the Hayes Ranch now. The fence posts, the seep spring, the hay rotation, the water trough conversation with Frank, the flooded pasture in the dark, the land office counter, and Haskell stepping back with his version of reluctant cooperation. She thought about the notebook in her coat pocket with the document numbers and the clean title language and the specific evidence that Victor Aldine's claim was built on nothing. She thought about the paper trail she'd been building since the night of the first letter. Every water record, every maintenance log, every supply inventory, every careful notation in the margins of the operation's daily life. And she understood that this was what she had actually been doing all along, not just for the ranch's protection against Aldine, but for her own. Every record was proof that she had been here, that the work had been done, that it was real. That she was real in the specific and permanent way that competence makes a person real. The frontier didn't give you belonging. She'd known that since her first week in Red Hollow. It didn't give you anything. But if you stayed and worked and kept the record honest, it could not entirely pretend you weren't there. That was enough. For now, it was enough. She blew out the lamp and went to her room, and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet around her. And in the morning, there would be the field shed rebuild to start, and the fence to finish, and Frank writing to Millhaven with a letter that would start the process of dismantling Victor Aldine's manufactured claim piece by careful piece. She fell asleep faster than she expected, which was what honest work did to you when you let it. Douglas Crane arrived at the Hayes Ranch on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Frank rode to Millhaven with the letter, and he was not what Mara had expected. She had built a picture of a frontier lawyer from the name and the reputation, something dry and formal, a man made of paperwork and careful distance, and Crane was none of that. He was 55, short and wide through the middle, with a brown beard going gray at the edges and the manner of someone who had spent decades watching people lie to him and had developed a permanent expression of patient skepticism as a result. He shook Mara's hand when Hayes introduced her and held it a beat longer than a formal handshake required, looking at her face rather than through her, and said, "You're the one who went to the land office." "Yes." "Good instinct." He set his bag on the table. "The filing records are the whole case. Everything else is noise." He spent the first afternoon going through what Mara had transcribed from the land office documents, and then he went through the paper trail she had been building since the night of Aldine's first letter. The water records, the maintenance logs, the supply inventories, the organized history of the ranch's operation and its water access. He read all of it with the same patient skepticism he seemed to bring to everything, making occasional notes in a small book, asking occasional questions that were short and specific and required short and specific answers. At the end of the afternoon, he closed the folder and looked at Hayes. Aldine's claim is fraudulent. The agreement he's referencing doesn't exist in the county records, and the chain of title is clean. I can file the affidavit with the land office this week and respond formally to his solicitor, and unless he has a forged document he's prepared to introduce, which carries its own legal risk for him, he has nothing. Can he forge one? Hayes asked. He can try, but the land office filing sequence and the original survey records create a paper continuity that a late insertion can't match without someone in that office cooperating. And Haskell has been in that job for 20 years and is not the kind of man who cooperates with that kind of request. Crane looked at Mara. When you went to the land office, did Haskell seem aware of what you were looking for? I told him what I needed. He wasn't helpful, but he wasn't obstructive. He would have told Aldine's people if they'd been there before you, Crane said. Standard gossip, small county seat, everyone knows everyone's business. Did you get there before they did? She hadn't thought about that. I don't know. Doesn't matter much. The record is what it is. And now we have the transcription with document numbers and I can verify it against the originals myself. He closed his notebook. I'll file the affidavit and give Aldine's solicitor 2 weeks to respond. If he responds with a forged document, we take it to the circuit judge and Aldine faces a fraud charge. If he doesn't respond, the claim dies for lack of evidence. Hayes looked at the table. And Aldine himself? The rumors, the pressure campaign? That's harder, Crane said without softening it. The rumors are gossip. You can't sue for gossip in this territory without witnesses willing to testify that Aldine's men made specific false statements, and finding witnesses willing to testify against Aldine is not easy. He knows that. He paused. The water claim is the thing we can fight and win. The rest of it, the reputation damage, the pressure, that fights itself if the operation keeps standing and keeps being seen to stand. He looked at Mara when he said that last part, and she understood that he meant her specifically, that her being here and visible and doing the work was itself an argument, the kind that didn't require a courtroom. She sat with that for a moment, the idea that her presence was a form of evidence, that simply not leaving was a kind of testimony. She had never thought about it that way before. She'd thought about survival and about work, and about what it cost to keep moving through a world that kept making her feel like a problem to be managed. She hadn't thought about the fact that continuing, that simply continuing, said something that nothing else could say quite as well. Crane stayed 2 days, long enough to verify the land office records himself on a ride into Red Hollow, and to draw up the stake agreement between Mara and Hayes that Douglas Crane witnessed and signed and took a copy of back to Millhaven for filing. The document was plain and specific, 10% operational stake in the Hayes Ranch, earned through the work performed in the preceding 11 months, with a schedule for potential increase tied to the ranch's growth over the following 3 years. Mara's name on that document, in her own careful handwriting, sat beside Hayes's signature like something that had always been there waiting for her to find it. She signed it at the table in the main house on a Wednesday evening with Frank Doyle and Gus standing as witnesses, because Hayes had asked them without asking her if that was all right. She had found she didn't mind. Frank Doyle's witness signature below hers meant something different than it would have 6 months ago. And she figured Hayes knew that. When Crane rode out on Thursday morning, Hayes walked him to his horse and came back inside and found Mara already at the supply ledger for the week. He sat down across from her and didn't say anything immediately, and she kept working, because that was what they did. He'll file the affidavit today, Hayes said. I know. And then we wait. And then we work, she said, which was the correction she'd been making in her own head since Crane arrived. The difference between waiting for Aldine to do something and continuing to build the thing that made his actions irrelevant. The waiting was harder than she wanted to admit. She knew it intellectually, that the best answer to Aldine's pressure was to keep the operation visible and solid and running. But the knowing didn't stop the mornings when she woke before dawn with the specific tightness in her chest that came from a threat she couldn't see clearly. She'd felt that tightness before, in Red Hollow, and she'd learned that the only remedy for it was to get up and go to work, so that was what she did. The field shed rebuild was finished in 8 days, one more than she'd estimated, because the high ground site had a section of hard clay in the subsoil that slowed the foundation work, But the finished structure sat 12 inches above the high water mark from the storm and faced its open side away from the northwest wind, and Gus, walking through it when it was done, said, "That's going to stand for 30 years," with the tone of someone stating a geological fact, and Mara believed him. The permanent fence repair on the east section was done in 5 days. The new posts set in concrete collars that Frank had suggested, a technique he'd learned years ago and hadn't applied on the ranch because the previous fence layout hadn't warranted the extra work. But the new footing positions did. She hadn't known about the concrete collars. She told him so. He told her where he'd learned it. It was a conversation of maybe 40 words, and it was the best conversation she'd had with Frank Doyle in 12 months. The ranch moved through October and into November with the particular momentum of a place that has been tested and held. The main herd came off the summer pastures in good condition. The dry cows and young stock had grown through the season without the losses that a less prepared operation would have taken during the dry stretch and the storm. The supply ledgers for the year, when Mara ran the numbers at the end of October, showed an operation that had spent carefully and lost less than the previous 2 years combined. Hayes looked at those numbers for a long time. Then he said, "We've been running this ranch wrong for years. Not badly. Just wrong." "Not wrong," she said. "Just without some of the information you have now." He looked at her. "You're being diplomatic." "I'm being accurate. You were running the operation you knew how to run. The information changed the operation." "You changed the operation?" She put the ledger down. "I gave you things to look at. You looked at them and made decisions. That's how it should work." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that was not about the ledger or the operation or the numbers, and it was the kind of thing that changed the temperature of a room when it was said, and she was not entirely surprised by it, but she was not entirely prepared for it either. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, in the way he said things when he'd been sitting with them for a long time before saying them, "about what this ranch looks like in 5 years, in 10. He set his hands flat on the table. "And I keep finding that the picture I have in my head has you in it, not as a stakeholder, as a partner." She was still. "I'm not asking you to answer that now," he said. "I'm not even sure I'm asking it as a question. I'm telling you what I see when I look forward, and I'm telling you because you deserve to know it, and because I've learned that you don't respond well to things you find out sideways." A pause. "Neither do I." She looked at her hands on the table, at the ink stain on her right index finger from the supply ledger, at the calluses that had built up on her palms from 12 months of ranch work. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not performed at, not managed, not tolerated, actually seen, by someone who had watched her work and thought about the future and put her inside it. She thought about the way she had felt on the day she arrived, stepping down from Hayes's wagon in the gray morning, hearing the ranch hand's low exchange and knowing its shape even without the words, the sheer weight of having to walk into a place that had already decided it didn't want her. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I'm not easy to be with. I don't mean my size. I mean I hold things close. I don't trust quickly. I've been disappointed enough times that I assume disappointment is coming even when the evidence says otherwise." She paused. "That's not going to change because the circumstances have." "I know that," Hayes said. "You think you know it." "Maybe. But I watched you spend 12 months in a house full of people who made it hard for you, and I never once saw you become someone other than yourself because of it. That's not a small thing to know about a person." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking for easy. I'm telling you what I see." She looked at him for a long time. The lamp was steady, no draft tonight, and the ranch outside was doing its nighttime settling, and she thought about how quiet it was here compared to the noise of Red Hollow. Not the physical noise, but the constant static of other people's opinions pressing in, the accumulated weight of being read wrong by everyone around you. "Give me time," she said. "All right," he said. And they went back to the ledger, and neither of them said anything else about it, and that felt right. The response from Aldine's solicitor arrived 2 weeks after Crane filed the affidavit, and it was not what any of them had expected, which was what made it dangerous. It was not a counterargument. It was not a forged document. It was a letter to the county land office, copied to Hayes and to Crane, formally withdrawing the water rights claim. One paragraph, clean and bloodless, citing a review of the filing records that had determined the basis for the claim was insufficient. Hayes read it at the table and said nothing. Frank, standing behind his left shoulder, read it and said nothing. Mara read it and felt the specific cold prickling of something that didn't fit. "He's not fighting," Frank said. "No," Mara said. "That means he's done. Or it means he's changed tactics and we don't know what to yet." She set the letter down. "A man like Aldine doesn't withdraw because he's wrong. He withdraws because he's found a better angle." Hayes looked at her. "What angle?" "I don't know, but we should assume he has one." She wrote to Crane the same day. Crane's response came back in 4 days and confirmed what she'd feared. There was talk in Millhaven from a reliable source inside the county land office, not Haskell himself, but a clerk who reported to him, that Aldine had been in conversation with 2 members of the county commission about a proposed road development that would run through the north edge of Hayes's property. A road assessment and development process, if initiated, could include compulsory land acquisition for right-of-way at assessed value, assessed by the county, rather than market value. It was elegant and it was vicious, and it was exactly the kind of thing a man who understood leverage would do when the direct approach failed. The water claim had been a test, possibly, a way of seeing how Hayes would respond, of measuring whether the documentation was solid, of identifying who at the ranch had the capacity to fight back. And when the answer came back organized and thorough and fast, Aldine had shifted to a longer game, one that operated through official channels and was much harder to fight with a paper trail and a good lawyer. She told Hayes. She watched his face go through the same sequence she'd watched before, the neutral external expression containing something much harder underneath, and she let him sit with it without filling the silence. "He can do this," Hayes said finally. It was not a question. "He can try. County road development is a legitimate process, but it requires commission votes and a formal assessment, and assessments can be challenged." She had been thinking about this since Crane's letter arrived. The challenge is that assessed value for compulsory acquisition is almost always below market, and if the right-of-way cuts through the north edge, it affects the water table access for the high pastures. She paused. "But road development proposals require public notice and public comment. That's law. And public comment means neighbors, and Aldine's neighbors are not all his allies." Hayes looked at her slowly. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that the smaller ranches in this valley have all been watching what Aldine does. The 3 he's displaced, people knew those men, knew those operations, and the remaining ones have been doing the math on when it's going to be their turn." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "If we can show them that Aldine's water claim against us was fabricated, and that we were able to fight it because we had solid documentation, and that the same documentation that protected us could protect them, they have a reason to speak at a public comment hearing that goes beyond just being our neighbor." Frank Doyle, who had been leaning in the doorway of the main room, said, "You're talking about organizing them." "I'm talking about giving them information and letting them decide what to do with it." She looked at Frank. "Nobody organized me. I did what I did because I had access to what I needed to know. If the other ranches in this valley knew what Aldine's water claim actually was, how it was constructed, what it depended on, why it failed, they'd have a clearer picture of what they're dealing with." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Some of those ranchers won't want to be seen to oppose Aldine directly. He's big enough to make their lives difficult in ways that don't look like retaliation. I know. I'm not asking them to take him on. I'm asking them to show up at a public comment hearing and talk about their operations and their relationship to the land and the water." She looked at Hayes. "A road development proposal needs commission support. Commissioners need votes. Commissioners are not entirely indifferent to what their constituents say at public meetings." Hayes was still for a long moment. Then he said, "You'd need to reach those ranchers yourself. I can write introductions, but this can't come from me. They'll see it as one big ranch asking the small ones to fight his battles." "I know. It has to come from me." "Why you?" She looked at him. "Because I'm not the Hayes Ranch. I'm a woman who arrived in this valley with nothing and built a record here and fought a claim with documentation and won. That's a different story from the big ranch defending its water rights." She paused. "And because the people who've been told I was running an angle here, the ones who heard Aldine's rumors, they should hear from me directly. It's the only way to make that story stop. Hayes held her eyes for a long time. When do you want to start? Tomorrow, she said. She spent the next 3 weeks riding, not the comfortable routes between the Hayes Ranch and Red Hollow, but the longer roads to the smaller operations scattered through the valley and the hill country to the north, the Peterson Ranch, the Drummond Place, the Hartley family who ran a mixed cattle and sheep operation in the high country and had been watching Aldine buy up their neighbors for 5 years with the specific stillness of people who know they're next and haven't figured out what to do about it. She didn't go as Colton Hayes' representative. She went as herself, which was the harder version and the only version that would work. She rode into each yard, said her name, said where she worked and why she'd come, and then she told them about the water claim and the land office filing and the affidavit and exactly why the claim had failed. She told them about the documentation that had made the fight possible. She showed them, when they asked, the transcription she'd made in the land office, the actual document numbers, the specific language, the proof of an unencumbered title. Some of them had already heard about the water claim. The frontier was not a quiet place for news. What they hadn't heard was the mechanics of how it had been defeated, and that was the part that made the difference. A man named Carl Peterson, who had been running cattle in the valley for 20 years and had watched Aldine absorb 2 of his closest neighbors through processes he hadn't understood well enough to fight, sat at his kitchen table with Mara's transcription in his hands and read it twice and then looked up and said, "If I'd had this 3 years ago, I'd still have Bill Farrow as a neighbor." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." "What do you need from me?" "I need you to come to the public comment hearing when it's called. I need you to talk about your operation and your water access and your relationship to the land in this valley. I'm not asking you to accuse Aldine of anything in public. I'm asking you to be present and to speak truthfully about what you know." He turned the transcription over in his hands. "My wife thinks I should have fought harder for Bill." "Maybe. But you're here now, and you can fight for what's here now." He came to the hearing. Most of them did. The public comment hearing for the proposed North Road development was called by the County Commission in the second week of December, 6 weeks after Crane had first informed them of the proposal. It was held in the Red Hollow Meeting Hall, a wooden building on the south end of Main Street that was used for town assemblies and the occasional traveling entertainment, and it was fuller than any meeting in recent memory, which Mara knew from the faces filing in through the door when she arrived that morning. She sat in the second row beside Hayes, who had recovered fully enough from his ribs to be upright and presentable, if not entirely comfortable, in a wooden chair. And Frank Doyle sat behind them, and behind Frank sat Gus and Pete and Roy Castle and Cal and Dale and the rest of the Hayes Ranch crew in their work clothes, which was a statement of a kind without being a speech. The commission was 3 men, and they sat at the front table with the formal discomfort of local officials who had not expected this level of attendance for a road proposal. Victor Aldine sat to the right of the room with his solicitor and 2 of his senior men, and he looked at the room's attendance with the expression of someone who has made a calculation and is now revising it. He looked at Mara once. She held his gaze without anything in her face that he could use, and after a moment he looked away. The commission chair, a man named Everett Cole, opened the hearing and explained the proposal, a county road to run from the Millhaven Junction through the North Valley, providing improved access to the high country operations. He explained the assessment process and the compulsory acquisition provisions and the right-of-way dimensions and the timeline. He kept his voice neutral, which was the voice of a man who had been told this was a straightforward proposal and was already not sure that was true. Then he opened the floor for public comment. Crane spoke first, on behalf of Hayes, presenting the chain of title documentation and the recent affidavit and establishing for the record that the north edge of the Hayes property where the proposed road would run was fully unencumbered and that any acquisition proceedings would need to be measured against accurate current market valuation, not assessment. He spoke for 11 minutes and was precise throughout. And when he sat down, the room had a specific quality of attention that meant everyone had understood what he'd said. Then Carl Peterson stood up. He stood with his hat in his hands the way men stand when they mean what they're about to say. And he talked about his water access and his relationship to the North Creek system and the way the valley's water moved through connected properties. And he said, plainly, without accusation, that any road development affecting the Hayes Ranch's north edge would affect the water table for his own high pastures downstream, and that he was present to say so for the record. Peterson sat down. Robert Drummond stood up and said something similar about the ridge drainage. The Hartley family's eldest son stood and talked about the sheep operation and the shared stock trails that ran through the North Valley, and what a road disruption would mean for seasonal movement. 4 more ranchers spoke, one after another, each with something specific to say about the connected nature of the valley's land and water, each measured and factual and impossible to dismiss as hysteria or opposition for opposition's sake. Aldine's solicitor tried to speak twice and was reminded both times that the floor was for property owners in the affected area, which he was not. Mara did not speak. She had planned not to. She had said what she needed to say in those 3 weeks of riding, in those kitchens and yards and hay-smelling barns across the valley, and the room full of people speaking from their own knowledge was the argument, not her. The worst thing she could do now was make it about her. She sat in the second row and watched the commission chair's face as each person spoke, and she watched him writing notes in the way of a man who is recalculating the political weight of what he's been asked to sponsor. And she thought about Victor Aldine to her right and the specific quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of a man who has had the ground shift under him and is deciding what to do next. The hearing concluded without a commission vote on the proposal. Cole announced that the commission would take the public comments under consideration and issue a response within 30 days. That was the language of delay, which in this context meant the proposal was in trouble, which in this context meant it was going to die quietly in a commission meeting that nobody would attend. She knew it, Crane knew it. Hayes, who had sat beside her for 4 hours without showing anything on his face, knew it. She could feel it in the room as people began to stand and put on their coats and exchange the specific kind of conversation that people have when they've done something together, and it worked. Carl Peterson stopped beside her on his way out. "That was good work," he said. "You did the work," she said. "You showed up." "We showed up because you came out and told us the truth." He put on his hat. "That's its own kind of work, Miss Whitfield." She thought about that on the ride back to the ranch, in the cold December afternoon with the mountains going blue on the horizon, and Hayes riding beside her and Frank a length behind, and the rest of the crew strung out along the road behind them. She thought about truth as work, the specific effort of it, the cost of going into rooms and saying what you knew and making yourself available to be disbelieved. She had been doing it for 12 months without thinking of it that way, just doing it because the alternative was to let other people's stories stand unchallenged, and she'd had enough of that in Red Hollow to last her the rest of her life. Hayes said, riding beside her, "You thought of the hearing." Crane thought of the challenge process. I thought of the neighbors. The neighbors were the hearing. He looked at the road ahead. Aldine has been running this valley alone for years. Nobody pushed back because nobody knew what they were pushing against. You showed them the shape of it. She thought about the 11 months of documentation, the maintenance logs, the water records, the supply inventories, the land office transcription. The paper trail she'd built not knowing exactly what she was building it for, just knowing that honest records were the only armor that held up over time. "I've been building things since I got here," she said. "I didn't always know what I was building them toward." "Most of the best things are like that," Hayes said. She looked at him. The afternoon light was coming sideways off the hills, and it put a long shadow ahead of his horse, reaching east toward the ranch, and she thought about what he'd said at the table. "I keep finding that the picture I have in my head has you in it," and about what she'd said in return, which was, "Give me time," and about the fact that time had passed and things had happened, and the picture was clearer now than it had been then. She didn't say anything about it on the ride home, but she thought about it. The commission's written response came in January, 22 days after the hearing, and it rejected the road development proposal on the grounds of insufficient public support and unresolved questions regarding impact on existing water access arrangements in the affected area. The letter was addressed to the commission record and copied to all parties, and it was, in its bureaucratic way, complete. She read it at the table in the morning and set it down and sat with her coffee for a moment, and that was her version of celebrating. Hayes found her there and read it over her shoulder and said, "Done," in the tone of a man closing a ledger on a balanced account, and she said, "Done," and meant the same thing. Victor Aldean never responded publicly to the commission's decision. He didn't withdraw from the valley or sell his operation or do anything dramatic. He simply stopped. The rumors in Red Hollow about Mara running an angle on the Hayes Ranch dried up through the winter the way rumors do when they're no longer being fed. Not refuted dramatically, just starved of the attention that kept them living. By February, when she rode into Red Hollow for the supply run, the looks she got on Main Street were different. Not warm, not most of them, but different. The particular look that says we have revised our opinion of you without being willing to say so directly, which was as much as she'd ever expected from Red Hollow and enough. Floyd Garner, of all people, was the one who said it plainly. She was at his counter in March, buying nails and a length of wire for a fence repair, and he counted out her change and set it on the counter. On the counter, not thrown, not pushed, set. And he said, without looking directly at her, "Heard you did well for Hayes this year." She picked up the change. "I did my job," she said. He looked up then, briefly, with the expression of a man who is aware of something he did and is not going to apologize for it directly, but is trying to find a way to acknowledge it costs something. "Suppose I heard some things early on that weren't fair," he said. She looked at him. She thought about the bread on the floor. She thought about what it had felt like to stand in this doorway with her coin purse in her hand and the morning sun behind her, and to make the choice that she made, to leave without picking up the bread, to refuse the diminishment, and how that choice had been a beginning of something she hadn't been able to see at the time. "Yes," she said. "You did." She took her nails and her wire and walked out. She didn't slam the door. She didn't need to. She had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you can do to someone who has tried to make you small is to refuse the smallness. Not with drama, not with confrontation, but with the simple, steady insistence of continuing to exist at your actual size. The spring brought new calves and a good water year and a fence line that held through the March winds without losing a single post. It brought Carl Peterson stopping by the Hayes Ranch twice to talk through water management questions, and Robert Drummond sending his son to spend a week learning the hay rotation system that Gus had refined through the winter. It brought 3 letters from smaller ranches in the high country asking if Mara Whitfield might be available for consultation on supply organization and livestock management, which she was not. She had her own operation to run, but which she answered personally and thoroughly because information shared was what had made the difference, and she understood that. It brought, on a Tuesday in April with the south pasture going green and the creek running clean and high from the snowmelt, Colton Hayes finding her at the fence line where she was checking the new spring growth of the grass against the maintenance notes from the fall, and saying without preamble the thing that had been sitting between them since October. "I'd like to ask you properly," he said. She kept her eyes on the pasture for a moment. "I know. And you've had time." "I have." She looked at him. He was standing the way he stood when he wasn't performing anything, square and still, with the sun on the left side of his face and his hat in his hand and his eyes doing what they always did, which was look at her without the editing layer. "The answer is yes." He held her eyes. "You're sure?" "I'm not sure of most things," she said. "I told you that in October. I'm sure of this." He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any of the surface gestures that the moment could have carried. Just took it, the way you take hold of something you intend to keep. They stood at the fence line for a while without talking, looking at the south pasture and the mountains beyond it, and the long reach of the valley that had tested everything both of them had and found it sufficient. Not perfect, not smooth. Sufficient, which is the real word for the kind of strength that actually holds. She thought about a lot of things standing there. She thought about the stage depot in Red Hollow, and Theodore Crane's pale face, and the long sequence of humiliations that had preceded this moment, not as wounds to be carried, but as the specific education that had made her into the person standing at this fence line, which was not the person she would have been without all of it. She thought about Caleb Purdy and his coffee tin and his upturned crate and the way he'd said, "You're still the biggest person here by any measure that counts." And she thought about how long it had taken her to believe it and how different the world looked now that she did. She thought about the bread on Floyd Garner's floor. There are moments that define you not by what you do, but by what you refuse to do, and that had been hers. The refusal to pick up the diminishment, to accept the terms that other people set for her value, to make herself smaller so that their cruelty could feel like her problem. She had walked out of that store with nothing in her hands and everything intact. And the road between that morning and this one had been longer and harder and more costly than she could have predicted, but she had walked every mile of it without becoming someone other than herself. And that was the thing she was most proud of. Not the seep spring, not the paper trail, not the hearing or the commission's letter or Victor Aldine's silence. Those were the work, and the work was real, and she valued it for what it was. But the thing she held on to, standing at the Hayes Ranch fence line in April with Colton Hayes's hand around hers and the spring coming in strong across the south pasture, was simpler than any of it. She had stayed herself. In every room that tried to make her less, in every exchange that offered her the comfortable option of shrinking, in every moment when becoming smaller would have been easier than the alternative, she had chosen her own actual size. That was the lesson the frontier had given her, not in one moment, but in thousands of them, accumulated over years of being underestimated and overlooked and thrown bread across dirty floors. The lesson was not that you had to prove yourself to earn your place. The lesson was that you had to refuse, quietly, steadily, without drama, and without apology, to accept any definition of yourself that came from people who had never bothered to look. Mara Whitfield had been told her whole life what she was and wasn't worth. She had let those voices live inside her longer than she should have. But she had also, in the end, walked out of Floyd Garner's store and gotten on a wagon and come north to a place that didn't want her either, and built something there anyway. Not because someone gave her permission, not because the circumstances were favorable, not because it was easy, but because she was still there and the work was real, and eventually the record told the truth. The south pasture was green in the April sun. The creek ran clear. The mountains sat permanent and indifferent on the horizon, the way they always had, the way they would long after everyone in this valley was gone. Mara looked at all of it and felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that she was standing exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because someone had finally accepted her, because she had stopped waiting for permission to arrive. She looked at him. She thought about the bread on the floor. She thought about what it had felt like to stand in this doorway with her coin purse in her hand and the morning sun behind her, and to make the choice that she made, to leave without picking up the bread, to refuse the diminishment, and how that choice had been a beginning of something she hadn't been able to see at the time. "Yes," she said, "you did." She took her nails and her wire and walked out. She didn't slam the door. She didn't need to. She had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you can do to someone who has tried to make you small is to refuse the smallness, not with drama, not with confrontation, but with the simple, steady insistence of continuing to exist at your actual size. The spring brought new calves and a good water year and a fence line that held through the March winds without losing a single post. It brought Carl Peterson stopping by the Hayes Ranch twice to talk through water management questions, and Robert Drummond sending his son to spend a week learning the hay rotation system that Gus had refined through the winter. It brought 3 letters from smaller ranches in the high country asking if Mara Whitfield might be available for consultation on supply organization and livestock management, which she was not. She had her own operation to run, but which she answered personally and thoroughly because information shared was what had made the difference, and she understood that. It brought, on a Tuesday in April with the south pasture going green and the creek running clean and high from the snowmelt, Colton Hayes finding her at the fence line, where she was checking the new spring growth of the grass against the maintenance notes from the fall, and saying without preamble the thing that had been sitting between them since October. "I'd like to ask you properly," he said. She kept her eyes on the pasture for a moment. "I know. And you've had time." "I have." She looked at him. He was standing the way he stood when he wasn't performing anything, square and still, with the sun on the left side of his face and his hat in his hand and his eyes doing what they always did, which was look at her without the editing layer. "The answer is yes." He held her eyes. "You're sure?" "I'm not sure of most things," she said. "I told you that in October. I'm sure of this." He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any of the surface gestures that the moment could have carried. Just took it, the way you take hold of something you intend to keep. They stood at the fence line for a while without talking, looking at the south pasture and the mountains beyond it, and the long reach of the valley that had tested everything both of them had and found it sufficient. Not perfect, not smooth, sufficient, which is the real word for the kind of strength that actually holds. She thought about a lot of things standing there. She thought about the stage depot in Red Hollow, and Theodore Crane's pale face, and the long sequence of humiliations that had preceded this moment. Not as wounds to be carried, but as the specific education that had made her into the person standing at this fence line, which was not the person she would have been without all of it. She thought about Caleb Purdy and his coffee tin and his upturned crate, and the way he'd said, "You're still the biggest person here by any measure that counts." And she thought about how long it had taken her to believe it, and how different the world looked now that she did. She thought about the bread on Floyd Garner's floor. There are moments that define you not by what you do, but by what you refuse to do, and that had been hers. The refusal to pick up the diminishment, to accept the terms that other people set for her value, to make herself smaller so that their cruelty could feel like her problem. She had walked out of that store with nothing in her hands, and everything intact, and the road between that morning and this one had been longer and harder and more costly than she could have predicted. But she had walked every mile of it without becoming someone other than herself. And that was the thing she was most proud of, not the seep spring, not the paper trail, not the hearing or the commission's letter or Victor Aldine's silence. Those were the work, and the work was real, and she valued it for what it was. But the thing she held on to, standing at the Hayes Ranch fence line in April with Colton Hayes' hand around hers and the spring coming in strong across the south pasture, was simpler than any of it. She had stayed herself. In every room that tried to make her less, in every exchange that offered her the comfortable option of shrinking, in every moment when becoming smaller would have been easier than the alternative, she had chosen her own actual size. That was the lesson the frontier had given her, not in one moment, but in thousands of them, accumulated over years of being underestimated and overlooked and thrown bread across dirty floors. The lesson was not that you had to prove yourself to earn your place. The lesson was that you had to refuse, quietly, steadily, without drama, and without apology. To accept any definition of yourself that came from people who had never bothered to look. Mara Whitfield had been told her whole life what she was and wasn't worth. She had let those voices live inside her longer than she should have. But she had also, in the end, walked out of Floyd Garner's store and gotten on a wagon and come north to a place that didn't want her either, and built something there anyway. Not because someone gave her permission, not because the circumstances were favorable, not because it was easy, but because she was still there and the work was real, and eventually the record told the truth. The south pasture was green in the April sun. The creek ran clear. The mountains sat permanent and indifferent on the horizon, the way they always had, the way they would long after everyone in this valley was gone. Mara looked at all of it and felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that she was standing exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because someone had finally accepted her, because she had stopped waiting for permission to arrive.